All right, so I was just telling some of our panelists that we're batting cleanup, so we better not be boring, okay? Everyone be exciting. Everybody say something mildly but not offensively controversial, and we'll try to get tongues wagging and people thinking. So why don't we start? We're talking about an innovation ecosystem. Now, Phil Duffy is a management consultant, which means he's very good at defining concepts. So we're going to put all the pressure on Phil to start this one off. When we talk about a food innovation ecosystem, especially in BC, what does that mean to you?
I'll give the kind of high-level constructs and some examples within BC, and then I'd say I'll talk a little bit about the external factors of influence that would help to, I guess, drive momentum around an innovation ecosystem. So from what I see provincially, nationally, globally, one of the most important factors is about focused investment. So where is the investment coming? How is it being utilised? How is it being funded? So to a point from the earlier panel, how are we ensuring that the IP from that investment remains, in the province and remains active, remains dynamic? I would say the next part of that would be around Agritech incubators. So how do we create Agritech incubators? I would point to SFU, the Kai example we were talking about earlier on, as one of those with regards to funding early stage scale-ups, investing in research and development, and then taking advantage of the over 300 different regional and rural accelerators that the government funds to then scale up and get to that, venture capital stage. The next place that I would go is around knowledge exchange. So we've got a lot of great trade agreements. I know obviously Consul General from India, Consul General from Netherlands and Switzerland, I believe, were here today. How do we take advantage of that to adopt and adapt some of the best practices from around the world? I know one of my colleagues in the room, David, works very closely with our Australian practice, looking at some of the work that they've developed with the Government of Australia with centralising data, back to the earlier point from David Gilmore, so that all agricultural producers can access it and benefit from it. So that's a couple. I'd say the other one that's been talked about is flexibility in policy. I'll take an example of the Abbotsford floods a couple of years ago. We took a permitting situation that would have previously taken a year and did it in 48 hours. So I think if we start to look at where we can be flexible with policy, with the government, that creates the environment for that innovation ecosystem. And ultimately, I think the last point is a really kind of focused incubation and collaborative ecosystem. So we need academia, we need industry, we need government, we need to advocate for Indigenous and some of that knowledge transfer, and we need to bring all that together where everyone's playing on a level playing field. We see it happening across Canada. We've got obviously the federal CAP fund. We've got funding through the Ministry of Agriculture, Feed, Grow and Buy BC. There's lots of programs available, but ultimately we need to have a client for that innovation ecosystem. So we would need to be working directly with the agricultural producers to understand where is their aptitude or ability to consume that, because it can't be tech for tech's sake. It needs to be business outcomes enabled by tech.
Well, I think you pretty much covered the whole thing. All right, we're done now. Let's go get drinks. So, Woo-Soo, can you expand a little bit on the work that the BC Centre for Agricultural Innovation at SFU is doing to fill those gaps in the ecosystem?
Oh, yeah. So, I like to say BC CAI, we call the BC Centre for Agritech Innovation in SFU. We are the ecosystem builder, actually. So we do three main pillars of work. The number one is industrial project creation, number two, training program creation, and number three is actually ecosystem building by having relevant workshops and some events together. So these kind of events, right? So. And one of the important things we push forward nowadays is we heard a lot of efforts from the traditional, right, indigenous communities effort, right? So we would like to put effort on the synergy making between traditional methodology indigenous communities working on together with the current cutting edge technology and agri-tech technology.
Thanks very much. Rachel, you're with Mitacs. Can you talk a little bit about the history of Mitacs, which has a long and robust history of working between post-secondary institutions and business, and anything that you see evolving in that space over the last number of years to support the growth of agricultural innovation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question. Well, to start, Mitacs has been around for over 20 years. I think we're coming up on 25 years. And it started as an NC, a Network Center of Excellence in mathematics specifically. Now we support research in all domains and areas, of course, including agriculture. And when I joined just over a year ago, my boss said, you know, you can be a generalist, work with all the sectors. But my background is in agriculture, so I thought, okay, here we go. we're gonna do this on the agriculture side. So, in terms of what we're able to do, we're able to help build that ecosystem as well by pairing researchers from academia with companies, not-for-profits, hospitals, entities doing research in maybe a less formal way, and bring them together to get that synergy and hire students to do that work. So it's a really interesting space because I find those two areas approach research and approach problem solving in such a different capacity. And you just get really interesting collaborations out of that. So what I would also add is the way that I got started on agriculture in my own career was by doing an internship. I'm from the city. I grew up thinking food came from Safeway, you know, that's the honest truth. And this opportunity to see where my food came from was just captivating for me. And so I think that's something when we think about how do we build these talent pipelines, how do we get today's youth interested in agriculture, it's through exposure. And so I like to think that that's something that Mitacs can provide, an opportunity for young people to try something they wouldn't have tried otherwise. And that could impact the trajectory of their career.
On that note of engaging with the community and inspiring young people, Bill Vanderkooi, you have many companies and many titles. Nutriva Group, EcoDairy, now EcoFarm, obviously a very robust operation that you're running at Bakerview. But one of the things that I think you're best known for in Abbotsford is the extent to which you really bring the community in. And you inspire young people, you inspire people of all ages to have a greater awareness of what's happening, to understand agriculture better, to understand agri-tech innovation better. Can you expand a little bit about how you root innovation in community and create inspiration in community?
Sure. Actually, it was interesting listening to Murray just after lunch talking about their experience when it comes to salmon fishing and really trying to engage the younger generation, that they're getting it brought to the long house and consuming it and not really seeing or experiencing the fishing. So I kind of draw a parallel. In our case, yeah, there's lots going on, but one of the mandates for the EcoFarm is to inspire a love for agriculture, and we start really young. So I think it's kind of depends on the age group. So we run, for example, we call it a cow school. It's kind of preschool kids. They get to learn their letters and numbers, but kind of through the farm experience. So that's just one example. We do a ton of kids camps, so that's going to be a bit older kids. Those would get more exposed to the robotic milker and kind of where their food comes from. They do some activities like make butter and that sort of thing. So I feel like ultimately, as they get older, you're going to get more into the technology side of agriculture and how food is produced. Yeah, I think just starting young, getting people on the farm, getting their hands dirty, interacting with the animals. We have a small community garden. They get to plant plants and kind of see that grow over the summer. I just think, yeah, BC, we are so fortunate. We have so many great resources, so many great programs, and it's just really, finding innovative ways to kind of bring that together. And really, yeah, one of the focuses is on that next generation and make sure, I'm not getting any younger, so we need new and up-and-coming entrepreneurs, people that are super passionate about farming and food. And there's really, obviously with urbanization, there's been a huge divide that's happened kind of between, city and farm. And so many kids have never been on a farm. So that's kind of an example of how we've tried to address that challenge.
Thanks so much, Bill. Last week I was at a placemaking summit in Vancouver, and I had the opportunity to hear from one of the senior executives of an organization called New Lab, big tech accelerator, incubator, innovation hub that started in New York. One of the things that they said that really stuck with me was that when it comes to creating ecosystem supports, the founder is the customer. The entrepreneur is the customer. All of us on this stage are in the business of providing ecosystem supports, and we just had a fantastic opportunity to hear from 5 entrepreneurs. What did you take away from that panel in terms of the kinds of issues and opportunities that they identified, and did any of that change or align with the way that you think about developing a supportive ecosystem? Why don't we go to Wusu on this first?
So right before the panel discussion, one of the things impressive was about the frustration of regulation, right? So maybe regulation can give us the opportunity too, right? So for example, something like food safety regulation, we can think about more, right? The food processing technology, etc. And then if there's an environmental kind of standard and regulation, then we can think about more on the eco-friendly food and etc. Right? So that's the positive side, but the other side is out there. We felt that, right? And then those standard and regulations, we can probably get more lesson from global standard who are doing best practice outside it too.
Rachel, do you want to pick up on that?
Sure. I have 2 thoughts on supports for the innovation ecosystem. So I think one would be related to what came up earlier. If we want these companies to grow, they need to be finding markets outside of Canada. We are a big country. We have a lot of land, but the market is finite. And so we need to look at ways that we can help people get out there. And Mitacs does have programs to help a little bit, but it's a drop in the bucket. And I think that's something that we could all think about. And by doing that, we can keep some of the IP here, avoid having these companies be bought out and move their operations elsewhere, and they can establish their research and development here. That sounds wonderful to me. I had another one. I lost it for now. I'll let you know if it comes back.
Sounds good. Phil?
Yeah, so it's funny, and you asked us to be conflictory, or I don't know how you termed it, so I'm going to be conflictory. I think what I heard from the entrepreneur panel was about barriers to enablement, and I think a lot of it came down to policy flexibility. I would put it on the other side as well. I also heard that those innovators were fairly mobile. So when you talk about IP and IP retention within BC, and you talk about it from a GDP perspective, okay, so how do we make those companies more sticky, those entrepreneurs more sticky to BC? And then from that side, government will probably be more incented to try and be flexible with those policies. I think that it's about looking at the early stage and late stage entrepreneurs and creating an ecosystem or environment that's supportive of that technology, that's supportive of that scale, that has both early stage and late stage venture capital, and then the retention of those skills. So hearkening back to kind of the Agritech incubation, how do we create environments at an academia level, as well as those internships with the businesses to have a connection in the community, have a connection in the province. It needs to be flexible on both ends. An ecosystem doesn't happen through one actor, it happens through many. I would say at the moment, there are many funding mechanisms, many grants mechanisms, many different reasons why we should act. If you start to look at disruption outside of kind of the ecosystem itself, talk about succession planning for, you know, multi-generational farms, talk about skills retention, talk about sustainability and market pressure from consumers, demand-based, I wouldn't say it's supply chain issues now, it's demand-based issues. We need to start to look at, you know, global geopolitics. Like, there's a lot of other influencers that we need to look at as a whole. I don't think it's just the entrepreneurial side of it, but it's very important.
Thanks, Phil. Bill?
I'm going to keep it simple, kind of two main things, and yeah, I think the panel before us did a really good job speaking to both of these. The first one is just modernization of our policies and regulations. You know, I just met Mark at the lunch table, and then I heard his story. I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, this guy's got some strong persistence, you know, going through all of those hoops and doing it in series versus having something that could be coordinated more effectively. And then I'll just speak kind of selfishly. I think, you know, we're a farm, we're in the ALR. I think there's a huge need for modernization of ALR policies. You know, there are small steps that have happened over the years, like you start to see, I think Lenore talked about indoor vertical growing more recently, but that took, I think, 2 years plus. And before that, you know, agritourism, which we do, some farm retail, breweries, and so there's like these small little incremental steps that are probably spanned, you know, 6 or 8 years. Like that's just way too slow. Like I'm going to be retired before I achieve some of my goals based on, you know, modernization of the ALR. So that's number one. Number two, I think Phil talked a bit. Having a strategy in infrastructure, and in our case, it would be different than Abbotsford Tech District is a great example, is, you know, investing and kind of supporting infrastructure that allows for we're talking about innovation, collaboration, and a community, but we need physical space, physical you know, place to do these things. We have a unique location and site where we, again, a bit of a shameless promotion, where we can facilitate like a small Agritech hub, bringing in, talking to Mark, bring in, you know, his company, and they can do work with the drones, and, you know, it doesn't have to be a permanent station, but it's a place where it's the Silicon Valley concept. There's huge benefits to clusters. There's lots of research to support it. You know, higher paying jobs, more innovation, more cross-pollination. You know, look at this today. I picked up, you know, I've sent myself a bunch of emails of things I've heard that I feel like I can implement or follow up on. So again, I applaud this session as just an example of bringing the community together, get focus, but ultimately we still need these spaces where we can actually have people get together, physically do the things that we're doing. We're kind of, I still feel like we're still so siloed. You know, one person's over here and there. Half of us don't know what the other half is doing. So modernize policy and especially ALR regulations, and then investing and kind of permitting kind of these agri-tech hubs to propel the industry forward.
Those are some great points, Bill. One of the challenges I think we face is that there are people on the stage, people in this room who are developing the ecosystem, and I think we have a challenge of making sure that we're talking to each other, we're coordinating, we're seeing each other as complementary, not competitive, and we're making sure that the end user can understand how it all fits together. So, you know, from the perspective of each of your organizations and experiences, how do we make sure that we're not tripping over each other and that we're providing a coherent framework that a user who is not an expert in navigating an ecosystem can plausibly find their way into, get value from, and then carry forward? Phil, do you want to start on that one? No pressure.
No pressure. Solve innovation ecosystem. Yeah, so I mean, I would point to an example actually. So KPMG have done work with the Australian federal government where we established effectively a data sharing platform, the Agritech Finder, which was a centralized repository owned by the government that anyone could come and use. It was an enablement, but it was a very specific enablement to bring all of those communities together so that they had a centralized place to talk, to share. I would say in discussions with the province, with yourself, actually at the Frontier Collective event the other week when we were talking about innovation ecosystems, there seems to be, and I'll take on, it's a different missing middle, but a missing middle as far as that trusted actor to both act at the community level with farmers, but also then to integrate with the associations, with the Indigenous communities, with the government, with industry. And I think, and again, selfishly promoting, I think consultancies have a unique capacity there to fill that space. Because we're looking at the business outcomes. It's technology enabled in a lot of ways, but the business outcomes and the community outcomes, the provincial outcomes, because we're all dealing with the disruptors, you know, in the environment around food security. You know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Food's number one. We're all in this together and everyone's passionate about it. So being able to be an enabler of that environment to everyone, for everyone to talk together is key. I would say the provincial government has made some inroads. My team was part of a recent study. Gavin and Bill, I think, were involved as well, as was SFU and some of the Indigenous communities. And we went out and identified 160 ag tech innovators within BC who are, you know, taking their solutions and scaling them. But it's not a well-known thing. It's the best kept secret in BC. If we look at that and we look at how do we enable that better, I think it's taking that to the next step to say we need a focused task group or a focused initiative to then bring all those associations together. Similar to the task force that was set up, the Agritech task force, to then bring people together regularly and have a vector, not just momentum, but direction. Where do we want to take this thing? Where do we want to take innovation? How do we start to take some of the things that are working so well and then scale them, export them? If I look at agriculture in Canada, like it's a $4 billion revenue generator for the federal government that can then be invested back into healthcare, infrastructure, all of the things that we're living as citizens of Canada. It's a massive, massive opportunity for us, and I'm more of an optimist than a pessimist. I see BC's future in that and the diversification of, you know, agricultural producers that we have being key. So I think that's kind of what's needed, is that focused, you know, momentum and focused group to bring people together regularly across all of the innovation ecosystem.
Phil, I think you absolutely crushed that one. And unless anybody else wants to add, I'm going to go right to the next question because you decimated that question. You didn't leave any scraps
Just
on the
because I
table.
talk lots, yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully everyone understands me. Yeah.
So one of the things I've heard said about BC and the Canadian tech ecosystem is that we're not good at failing. We don't fail fast enough. We keep companies alive that should already have failed and moved on to the next thing. Not everyone necessarily might agree with that, but I think it's very important that there is market discipline and that companies that are entering a space, any space, are very conscious that they have product market fit. I think that we had some really great conversations over the course of the day that point to the importance of a connection between innovation and you know, applicability in the next season for the incremental food producer. So reversing the onus from the previous conversation around supporting the entrepreneur, how do we make sure that when we support entrepreneurship, when we support innovation, we're supporting innovation that has a clearly defined end user, that has a clearly defined product market fit, and is not a solution looking for a problem? Let's go to Bill on this first.
Sure. Just a guess on the first point. I think we're still a very early stage sector. We don't, you know, I guess this is, you call this an association and kind of, so maybe that is why we haven't matured to understand kind of failing fast is actually good. You can learn and move on to something else. Maybe we're kind of fledglings in a sense. And then to the second point, yeah, I think part of that growing process is building frameworks. Like I said earlier, I think we have so many great programs. We have support for research. We have Mitacs. We've got SFU, BC Chi. Like there's so much. We're so rich in assets or resources. So I think, like in our business, we have a framework process kind of for going through, you know, developing a business or whatever have you, and it's kind of based on four kind of 4 pillars. The first is, strategy, having a very well-defined, clear strategy, who's the customer, all those type of things. So it's both marketing and operations. So I feel you could sort of bring that to this sector. But I think at the end of the day, it still needs to be led by Minister Alexis, the Premier. Like, there needs to be bold leadership, and I feel like we're just kind of still waiting for somebody to take that step. Lenore articulated how that's very risky, especially with the ALR and some of those implications. So that's the first thing. I think number 2 is just operationally, how does the sector kind of come together? Do we need a center in the city, a center on a farm? How do we better communicate and align ourselves? All these great resources. Number 3 is people. I'm sure we'll talk about that, but just developing. We talked about inspiring young people, but how do we encourage more people to go into the sector? Hopefully AI and some things we heard earlier will help transfer some of those candidates into food and agriculture. And then finally, it's obviously the key is finance and making sure it's a model that's sustainable, that can scale, that can grow, that has margin. And ultimately, that's sort of answered with the first question is are you solving a problem for a customer? And have you validated that? So again, that's easy to kind of do the framework, but that requires tools and support. Again, that's part of building this ecosystem, and part of that strategy is making sure there's that support for startups and young people, and can start as early in university, getting the business department connected to science and agriculture and food.
Usu, do you want to talk on that?
Yeah, so in terms of resilience, right? So we would like to have a sustainability and more supporting of our ecosystem like that. So maybe in the private sector, quite not easy to break the silo or something. But from the public sector, right, like a post-secondary university and etc., we can probably think about more on that collaborative environment and then supporting system to private sector. Like one example is there's in states, especially in California, there's a UC cooperative extension system. So basically, whenever private sector has an issue and problem, they can just touch base with the university to get the solution together, right? So we probably need to adopt that kind of thing, right? And then again, like Peter said, one of the important thing is inspiring our next generation in terms of sustainability. We need to keep inspire our young generation to come into this sector, right? So that's one thing we push forward to. Thank you.
Phil?
I'll answer it a bit differently because I probably have all the way through, Gavin, sorry. So I think that connection to mentors, I'll put Bill as one of those, as people in the community who are leading entrepreneurial ventures in Agritech successfully in a number of different ways, whether it be sustainability in circular agriculture with reuse of cattle waste, cow poop, or whether it be about traceability, the work that he did with one of my colleagues, David, with the Farm of the Future, with traceability of Wagyu beef. Things like that, and shining a light on the success stories is as important to shining a light on, let's say, the failure stories. Although I've got an idea, and I'm going to challenge you, Gavin, on this. This was unexpected, so you probably shouldn't have asked me. I know that you have a forum with Cass, who's in the room with Frontier Collective, where we have monthly Thursday events at our Ignition Centre. We bring in different entrepreneurial or innovation leaders to talk about many different industries. And excuse the bad language, but there's a global venture called F-Up Nights. I won't say the whole word. But it's bringing in entrepreneurs who have failed and talking about why they failed, what they learned from it, and then how can they share that with the community so the community can be successful. It's very grassroots. Things like that. If I could say there's one takeaway or action, things like that help, because it shows that we're all fallible, but it also creates a fun venue for students, early stage entrepreneurs, others to come together and share stories in a safe venue where everyone has a common passion or common industry. So that might be something you could look at.
That's a great idea. If Johan Radui is still in the room, Is he? He's gone. I'll give him a shout out for starting, I'm going to say it, for starting Fuck Up Nights in Abbotsford. And certainly that's something that I think there's a lot of value in bringing back, just providing the opportunity to learn from failure. Failure is not a bad thing. Fail forward. Rachel, do you want to expand on the subject a little bit?
I think that's it. It's a cultural shift. It's a mindset where we live in a world where success is important, and making room for failure to be acceptable is, I think, the biggest barrier on that. Yeah, it's uncomfortable, but it's the only way that we're going to get somewhere. But then I think the other side of it is, we need to develop agriculture technologies that are going to work, and it's better to learn that in the earlier stages than later on when somebody's crop is on the line. So why not fail small?
I'm going to build on Phil's idea, and I'm just going to turn it right back on him. So starting with Phil, folks, what's the biggest F-up that you've seen in our efforts to build a stronger innovation ecosystem, and what did you learn from it?
I'll speak broadly, I'm not going to give specifics. I think at the moment, everyone's kind of pointing towards a need in the community or a need in, let's say, the ecosystem for the enactor of change, someone to take leadership. So, the government is there to govern, to regulate, to invest, but they're not there to fund private ventures who effectively can then take IP elsewhere, harking back to the earlier point. Entrepreneurs there are there to, create things, fail fast, scale up. Farmers are there, but probably have limited operational means to be able to adopt a lot of the technology that we're talking about. So each one of those actors, plus academia, plus industry, have got their own unique or innate need in the system to enact, but no one's taking the leadership to say, we're going to do that. And I think as far as an F-up event, that's not just, in the district, it's not in the province, it's nationally. Canada's fallen behind the world in innovation, despite the external disruptors that we talked about, climate change, resiliency, succession planning, food security, supply chain, all of the other things that we talked about earlier on. And I think that's a big F-up that we haven't really came to terms with yet. And that we need to address. But it's events like this where we can start to move that forward. If we're having open dialogues and trying to find out where we fit in that kind of ecosystem, we can move forward.
Thanks, Phil. Bill?
I think it was back in 2019, Premier Horgan initiated the Food Security Task Force. Lenore was one of the contributors. They did a fabulous job, got released in 2020 with, I think, some really great recommendations. It's not perfect, but I feel like the failure is, again, at my own risk, I feel like the provincial government has not really grappled with that report and put any policy, any real true strategy into action. So I feel like it's a huge missed opportunity. I thought it was like, this is brilliant. John commissioned this thing, it comes out, and then we get COVID, and we have food insecurity, and it's like, this is amazing. Like the stars have aligned, and here we're almost in 2024, and it's still just, I'm just speaking personally, so frustrating to see just not much action really happening. We have the one small little policy change that happened, and
I like you, Bill.
yeah, getting older, so I don't really care what people are thinking anymore. So I think that's the biggest F-up in this sector. I feel like, again, my challenge is to, specifically provincial government, is like, be bold, take a stand. I know there's really strong special interest groups, but I feel like there's a middle ground where we, again, ALR is critically important to protect farmland, but it's not black and white. So I think it's just like finding those middle areas that we can say, okay, Agritech on farmland totally makes sense. It's good for agriculture, good for farming, but they're so focused on the farm, and they're missing sight on what's good for the farmer in the future, and that's sad, actually.
Usu?
Yeah, thanks, Bill, talking about that report. So the 2020 Food Security Report, I think that's somewhat starting point for the government to think about the future agri-tech, actually. So one of the take-home message from that report is we need more talents in BC, right? So that's one thing in the sector. So agri-tech, as you know, it's kind of integrated technology. It's not just about traditional agriculture. It has a bunch of different engineering aspects and science there, right? So BC CAI, I want to promote too. So BC Center for Agritech Innovation is established not from the nowhere. It's a kind of a collective, based on collective efforts or something like this. And SFU and all the post-secondary institutes in BC, we are putting forward to grow our talents here in BC, right? So that's a one really important thing for future.
Rachel, what was one of the biggest mistakes we made, and what can we do better? No pressure.
I think adding to the conversation, the biggest thing I can think of is just taking more risks. Like, it's a risk to not take the risk, to not put yourself out there for the chance to fail. And I think the more we're thinking about pushing forward instead of like, okay, I developed the product and it's in the market and life's good, now I'll just sit back and relax. No, like, let's keep going, let's push forward, continue to push boundaries, because I think that's going to hold us back.
How do we inspire and educate the next generation of tech-enabled farmers and food producers, and how do we instill them with that mentality of the right kind of risk-taking that Rachel just talked about? Bill, I want to throw to you on this first because I just love everything you do at EcoFarm.
Yeah, I think it spans a pretty broad spectrum. We talked a little bit about kind of inspiring young people, just getting them on the farm, getting their hands dirty. Again, I think there's so many great programs. We got Mitacs and BC CAI. And BC CAI does help promote, and we have several projects, not just with BC CAI, with BC Agritech, KPMG. We're working with private sector, but also through TRU on a beef study, UFE on the rice cultivation. So again, there's hope. Like there is collaboration happening kind of through the whole value chain from academia, industry, and key partners through research. So I think getting young people involved, through internships, through getting more connected with universities and getting people, through some of these programs, it is students doing the work. I'll just give you an example. So we have a lab that does feed analysis kind of for Western Canada. It's like a quick NIR scan and takes your forage, corn silage, whatever, and gives you the nutrients spectrum. So we have a girl, her name's Lara. She's worked there for us probably for 8 years. She's actually currently finishing her master's on a project we did with TRU. So there's an example of kind of like somebody, gaining an education. So again, finding ways to build an ecosystem that kind of facilitates that ease, I guess, of getting students. And we've had high school students, internships. I kind of look at our site as kind of like a microclimate, I guess, of the ecosystem. So I can give you examples. We have like a little ice cream stand, and we've hired people we have a couple people from Abbotsford, no farm background, come, they want to scoop ice cream. Then they graduate and they're doing tours at the Eco Dairy, Eco Farm. And now 2 of them are actually in university studying agriculture. So those are like tangible examples of just, again, the value of getting them on the farm, seeing, serving the food, learning where it comes from, kind of getting excited about the sector. So,
Phil, you want to get this one next?
So I'll give an example. So the team that work with all of the agricultural producers associations and things hadn't had any experience really in agriculture prior. And through that involvement and direct kind of conversation are now passionate about agriculture. Again, I think the fact that it hasn't transformed and is so open for disruption just now is actually a massive opportunity. So not that I'm that young, although I know I look very young. I think the opportunity to sell agri-tech and agriculture and that innovation ecosystem is huge. So we talked about internships, we talked about early stage bringing kids in to, to the eco dairy as an example. Having that mentorship and building in kind of sustainability, building in resiliency, building in, back to David Gilmore's point earlier on around generative AI, the ability to take emerging tech and then adapt it within the agricultural system is huge. It's one of the, like, if you look at the traditional industries within BC, forestry, mining, resources, oil, agriculture is not considered one of those. It should be. It should be. So how do you make agriculture sexy again? I think it's a collaboration between academia, between good actors in the environment within the ecosystem, as well as companies like KPMG and other consultancies to start to be in the community working with agricultural producers. I think that's also how we can start to gain trust with those generational farms to start to incent different behaviours. It's again quoting Microsoft again and David, but if we don't act now, we won't be around in another 10, 15 years. And it's not to say that that adoption of technology is somehow going to, remove jobs. It's going to change jobs. But if you're not embracing the technology, there won't be a job in another 10, 15 years. So I think that's where we need to go.
Phil, just to pick up on your point, yesterday I was at the Business Council of BC Summit. They put up a fantastic graph showing the composition of the BC economy. Agriculture accounts for 7% of BC's exports, which is on par with mining. So we should be talking about it. And I think, Phil, the other thing that you've shown is that one of the ways that you can make agriculture sexy again is to say it with a Scottish accent.
It's true. I won't sing.
Woo-Soo, over to you.
Yeah, so inspiring next generation comes into the talent securing, right? That's really important. So in the morning we had a good session, and then one thing I impressed was the question from our farmer, right? So open-minded and open dialogue with the farmers can probably give their inspiration to younger generations of their family, right? So that so we were just talking about the younger generation, but we need to talk a lot on current traditional farmers about, right, the new technology and the cutting-edge technology, something like that. So that's really important. And I think like an eco-farm, I can say we need more R&D hub, actually, that can feel our next generation move to that direction and then getting the talents to do. And I know UFV is very good job with the local agribusiness, right? That kind of practicality. I mean, showing that kind of practical application to students and younger generation, that's it. Yeah.
Thanks, Woo-Soo. Rachel, I know this is an area of passion for you.
Yes, definitely. I think the points that we've hit on are great so far, but I think one point that we haven't touched on as much yet is diversity in agriculture. It's not unusual for me to go to agriculture events and be one of 2 women in the room, and I think it's changing. I think that's great, but it's a reality, and I think we can do better. As well, I think, and this is something that you touched on, Phil, in your introduction to the topic, of bringing folks from around the world to work in this space. I've worked with incredibly talented people from all over the world in my time at McGill, and just the ideas and different ways that people have to solve things is inspiring to myself as a Canadian, and I think that's something that we just cannot underestimate. Let's bring more people in, and I think that creates an upward spiral.
Fantastic. I'm going to go to a couple of questions from the audience, and then my goal is going to be to get you out on time and to the reception. I see Lenore Newman down front. Question from a rock star.
Yeah, just thanks to everyone. Great panel. And some of the people in the room will know that I'm part of the consortium doing the national agricultural technology strategy because I didn't suffer enough on the provincial one, so I had to go and make it even bigger, and in French. But one of the things we're hearing loud and clear on our consultations right across the country is we are not retaining our successful medium-scale businesses. So we've invested a ton of money all the way along the chain, you know, training them, seeding them, getting them attached to VCs, doing incubation, acceleration, and there they are, and they wander off to California or somewhere like that. What do you see is the one key thing we could be doing at a national level or even provincial level to retain our successes and keep them here?
Who wants to go first on that one? Rachel?
I can take a shot at it. So I asked my dad the same question last week. I can't remember exactly how it came up. And his answer to the question, which I thought was smart and something that I hadn't heard before, was help them break into global markets. Because, as I said before, Canada is a limited-sized market. If these companies want to grow larger, they need customers outside of Canada. And what he was also explaining was that the challenge is there's only so much the government can do to support those companies at that stage. There are rules around that, and I'm not an expert in that, so don't ask me any more questions on it. But yeah, I think if that's something that we can solve, perhaps mentorship from companies that have been successful at making that leap would be something that would help the companies that are here.
Phil?
I'll try and answer the question as much as I can. I mean, fundamentally, I'm not one of those companies, so I think you're asking the wrong person. We need to be speaking to those people directly, consulting and then figuring out what's common and then solving to that would be what I'd say, but I'll give you an opinion anyway. So if I look at BC, specifically rather than nationally, 95% of our exports are small and medium businesses. They're not global multinationals. I think going back to the earlier point about that relationship to the community, that relationship to the economy is where we need to tackle it. So yeah, you can tie it down with IP ownership, but should we? Probably not. I think that's one of actually the successful things coming out of CAI is SFU doesn't retain IP of those startups and scale-ups. It's not tied to Higher Education Institute. There's risk to that, but it's also there's trust to it as well for some of those companies that are scaling up. So I would say, again, and I'll plug KPMG, starting to work with some of the global multinationals and global consulting firms to say what are the buyers buying, and then how does that align to the Canadian products, and then starting to matchmake is ultimately, and there's lots of federal and provincial teams who have that as their responsibility. I would say that's probably where you want to go, but ultimately it's a consulting process, which obviously, Lenore, you're involved with, so you probably have more insights than us on that. But yeah, that would be where I would go. You need to be tying them into the trade agreements with the Netherlands, tying them into the trade agreements with India and Australia. I know that there are trade agreements where we, albeit that maybe the carbon footprint isn't great, we have that trade where we'll produce the product but it will be packaged elsewhere, or there's an innate need for that asset, whether it be in the agricultural space or others. We're better together on additive, and I think that's where we need to be looking for some of those larger exports.
I'm going to go to a couple more audience questions and give Bill and Woosu the first crack at these ones. Tyler, you got somebody for me?
Thanks, a great conversation. So some of you already know that these challenges aren't unique to just agriculture sector, but even in forestry in BC, typically considered quite conservative. And we look to Scandinavian countries like how they have advanced their forest bioeconomy. And we can't change where we are. We can't change the past. But 50 years from now, like we have data suggesting what kind of climate, for example, would be in BC. And if I were to ask each of you one tangible action item, and who should lead that, so that 50 years down the road, our next generation does not say, oh, yeah, they did know what would happen, but they didn't do anything for that. Thank you.
I'll take that one. It's something I learned today. So I've I have 5 kids, and there's still a couple in high school, and the youngest his name is Joe. He's in grade 9. He loves to play video games and be on his electronics, and probably what happens when the youngest child, so he doesn't get managed as well as maybe the oldest couple. But I'm going to come up with a family rule. It's like for every hour of like gaming, he's going to spend an hour on ChatGPT and start figuring out how to use that. So I think really, I'm being serious. I feel like training and getting our kids equipped, and even tying into the previous question, I think we have some disadvantages. We're a massive country. There's diffusion. We're also neighbors to the most successful country in the world. You know, there's Microsoft, Google. There's lots of money. So I feel like, to Lenore's question, that is a huge challenge. Like, how do we retain it? We don't necessarily have the funding and capital. I think Phil talked about that. There's a massive market down there, agriculture included. So, yeah, so it's interesting. I think the TELUS agriculture model is maybe, could be one solution where they're starting to acquire some of those SMEs and retaining them in Canada and then taking them global. They're also buying companies all over the world too. So, it's staying in Canada, I guess, but it's not staying with the entrepreneur. But that's who knows the answer to that one. So, anyways, get your kids using ChatGPT. Take home message.
Wusu?
Yeah, I think my answer, coming back to our theme today, right? Making supportive ecosystem to, right, the respond to climate crisis or agriculture challenge to that, right? So, I mean, we can probably adopt some good examples like Japan is just launching government program of carbon offset. I think you heard about it, right? So basically their system is if farmers use biochar, right, and then using like, for example, 1 ton of carbon, then government pay $20. So they have actual policy about that kind of thing, a carbon incentive, right? I'm talking about one example about the incentive, right? So how can we give incentive to small and medium companies or farmers, right? We need to think about that inside of the supportive ecosystem too. Yeah.
Either one of you want to jump on this? We're getting low on time, so I'm going to go to Phil, can you say a sexy closing question? Just say sexy for us again.
Question?
No, just say the phrase, a sexy closing question.
A sexy closing question. I could say it in a Sean Connery accent if you would prefer.
All right, I'm gonna beg the indulgence of folks. I'm gonna take one more question from the audience, and then I want to give everyone a heads up because you have no idea this question is coming. So after this question from the audience, I want us to end on a note of inspiration. So after this question, I'm going to ask each of you succinctly to tell folks in the audience, because you all have deal flow. You all see interesting, cool things happening in ag. I want you, after this question, to share in closing the coolest, most exciting innovation that has come across your radar screen this year. Ideally something that folks in this room are gonna go to dinner, go home on the weekend, and be able to look really smart by talking about. So we'll go to the question in the back, and then we'll come back to that.
Hi, my name is Hassan. I was a previous panelist. I was one of the seeds, and you guys are building, right, or growing. So from just keeping with the agricultural thing, the seeds get planted, you grow the ecosystem. When you know it's time to harvest, meaning what are those key KPIs that would indicate that the ecosystem has reached critical mass and will be a global leader? The same thing you brought this, I will argue, the successful country, right? Like San Francisco, we know it's a tech hub now, right? What would those KPIs, and I would prefer numbers, right? Like what specific numbers we got, if we reach this number of this KPI, we know we achieve that ecosystem growth and we're ready to harvest the rewards.
No pressure. Wusu, I'm going to go to you on this one. We'll just do quick answers on this, and then we'll go to the closing question.
I don't have any.
Wusu's got, okay. Phil, you're my backup plan here.
I don't have a KPI, so I don't have a definitive number, but I could tell you where we are just now and what we need to do. So at the moment, we're seeing incomers to BC at present, 160,000 per year. We need to deal with that. That's obviously a demand on food. we're seeing $4 billion of revenue being generated through agriculture at a national level. We have tracking and assets and data on a number of Agtech companies in BC, which is growing, by the way, year on year. We have insights on the revenue being generated from those companies, and we have insights in terms of how that money's been refunded or reinvested. If we track them and we track progress against them, that's what we should be looking for, progress, and then it should be tracked against a base bottom line that says, 2% is not enough. It needs to be more than inflation. It's not KPI, but it's a rough order of magnitude.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to go over to my lovely assistant, Tyler, for one last audience question.
Thanks, Gavin. Craig Toes, Abbotsford Chamber. It kind of plays off of, I think, your last question. This morning we heard Canada's a powerhouse. We've also heard Canada's lagging. And I guess kind of playing off of Tyler's lightning round, if each of you could say, and it's unfortunate that our government officials don't seem to be here this afternoon, what would it take to shift us from incremental thinking to, we need a leapfrog effect to catch up? What's the biggest thing that you can name that we need to do to get the attention of government, the ecosystem, to really have that leapfrog effect?
Bill?
Bold leadership, policy modernization, and investment in kind of physical infrastructure, and I guess the concentration of these agri-tech hubs. I feel like that's an advantage. Yeah, the U.S. has figured out. It's like they do have these centers for, whether it's Silicon Valley or whatever.
I think open-minded adoption of best practice in the world, and also continuous education to regulatory bodies. Thank you.
Food security needs to be in the #1 mandate for the government.
I'll tap out.
I'll sub in for Rachel. Stop talking, start doing. That's it, right? And I think, that's a really important piece that everyone in this room can carry forward. I think what we need from policymakers is to get past the talk shops, get past the 2x2 matrices, no offense, KPMG, get past the reports and figure out when are we going to start doing? Because I think we do have a fundamental problem. It's bigger than ag. It's a problem that we have in Canada. We have become a, frankly, uninvestable jurisdiction in the eyes of some capital because it is so difficult to do things. We have so much incredible potential, and we've seen so much of it on display here today. But as a region, as a province, as a country, we need to get into the business of doing things. I'm going to go to the final question here and try to provide a note of inspiration on the way out the door. So no pressure, guys. I gave you all of 3 minutes to come up with the coolest thing that you've seen happening in ag and food innovation. And Bill looks like he's ready to go.
Sure. Scale up of full-blood Japanese Wagyu beef. I know there's still some beef consumers out there. And we're using like in vitro fertilization, genomic testing, and potential to bring the highest quality locally produced, but it's Japanese, full-blood Japanese genetics. So.
And it's delicious.
Very.
Wusu?
Yeah, so I observe a lot of fascinating projects going on in BC Kai over the year, right? So I can't pick really
you have to pick
interesting
one.
things, but one or two things I would like to proudly say is about the collaboration with the indigenous community companies, right? So one was actually training program. We funded drone training to one of the northern BC near Terrace, and the other one is berry protection, and then application to greenhouse setting from the West Bank First Nation. We really delight to see the combination and synergy between cutting-edge technologies and traditional methodologies.
Phil, what's the sexiest thing you've seen this year?
It was an integration of AI, weather network information, and mobile technology. It's called mesh technology. So basically, they put all those things together. I won't go into all the complexities of it, but to be able to send push notifications to farmers in sub-Saharan Africa during times of anticipated drought, so they could harvest ahead of it from a farm and food security, phenomenal. It's now been used in Bangladesh around floods.
Rachel.
My favorite project that I've seen go by was one that was founded by the Weston Foundation. It's a collaboration between SFU and KPU, where they're looking at how to produce carbon neutral, pesticide-free berries in BC. So get excited. Who doesn't love berries?
Very cool. I'm gonna also cheat and come in on this one. The coolest thing that I think that I've seen this year is this room. I'm so thankful to all of you for showing up today. This was an experiment that we threw out there. We didn't advertise this event. We started spreading it through word of mouth. We've had 180 people RSVP. So, you know, first off, thank you, because I think we've got a really strong mandate to continue with this kind of dialogue and this kind of event and format and approach. Can I get in closing, can I get a show of hands? Who would come back next year? Yep, okay, we'll be back. And with that, thank you very much.